that we have because we can trust in God's promises. But this all sounds so good to us in hindsight, doesn't it? On that Friday night, though, that would be Good Friday night, there were no poetic reflections about atonement. There was just a bloody, brutally beaten body hanging from a cross. Jesus was dead. And he was taken down, and he was buried. And the women were weeping, and the men were hiding, and it was night. And then it was day. And then it was night again. And it all seemed over. And that was the end of it. And then something happened. That Sunday morning and following. It's something that has had historians mystified for a while. Well, let me tell you what they agree on. And this is something you can take to the bank. In the last 50 years, there's been a real change in the way historians have viewed the historical documents pertaining to Jesus' life, especially regarding the resurrection, what happened that Sunday morning. Prior to that, they didn't care about it. They thought it was all myth and fable. Then they got careful, and they started learning more about the text and about the history and everything, and actually being more consistent and applying their historical rules to the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John texts that tell us about Jesus' life, and they have come now to a different conclusion. On the main, and I'm talking about critical scholars as well as Christian scholars. In other words, people on both sides of the track. The majority now agree to 4 different things historically about that morning and what soon happened. First, they agree that Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross and was buried in the tomb of a rich man. Okay, we got that. Second, they agree the tomb was empty Sunday morning. Third, they agree that various individuals, and some of them non-believers, James, for example, or Saul, and also groups of people made claims. Well, they didn't just make claims. It was obvious that these people experienced something, and the experience was what they called an experience of the risen Christ. Whether it was or not, it's a different question. But that's what they did experience something. It transformed their lives. And the fourth thing is they agree that belief in the resurrection is the thing that launched the early church. So in sum, the 4 things they agree on is the death of Christ, the empty tomb, the sightings, and the origin of the Christian faith. Now, what historians don't agree on is what explanation best accounts for those facts. And it seems to me there aren't that many options. I mean, there are a handful of crazy scenarios trying to explain those facts. I'll run a couple by you to show you how inadequate they are. Probably one of the most popular is that Jesus never died, that he just fainted and was revived in the tomb. Now, let's just think about this for a minute. You're suggesting that all of the physical abuse that Jesus took in the whippings, on the cross, being run through his chest with a spear, hanging naked on a cross all afternoon in the cold April air, declared dead by Roman soldiers who were well acquainted with death, taken down from the cross, had his body washed and packed with 100 pounds of spices. Now that's in the text. Then he is tossed into a cold cave for the weekend, and after a few days he feels better. And he is able to convince his doubtful disciples that he was the resurrected Lord of life. Well, if that appeals to you, you're welcome to it, you know, but not me. That doesn't make any sense. All right, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. Now, that would mean that the disciples who proclaimed the resurrection would know it to be false because they are the ones who stole the dead body. In other words, they had concocted this lie for what purpose? The basic rule is if you're going to lie about something, you're lying about something that's going to get you something good, not get you killed. Why would they lie about something they knew would get them tortured, flogged, and executed? Doesn't make any sense. Well, maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Okay. Did you ever go to the wrong tomb? I mean, that could happen. And then people say, oh, no, that's not the right tomb. The right tomb is right over there. Let's put an end to this resurrection business, produce the body. That would have been easy. Didn't happen. The most popular explanation, this was a hallucination. Now, I have a friend who's written a whole book about this, but I can give you the basic stuff very simply. Really, a hallucination. Yeah. A group hallucination. Listen, how exactly does that happen? Hallucinations happen in one's mind, right? It's like a dream. You have a dream last night, it's in your mind, it's not dancing around your bedroom for somebody else to see. Oh, I had a dream last night, my wife woke up and she saw it. It's in my head, as it were, actually in my soul. But the point is that this is first person private. How do you get 12 people to have the same dream at the same time about the same thing in exactly the same way? Does this sound to you far-fetched? Sure it is. By the way, do you know the difference between a dream and being awake? I do. I suspect they did too. There was one philosopher that even argued that Jesus had an identical twin. I was at the debate, UC Irvine, William Lane Craig and Greg Caven. And Greg Caven argued, yeah, well, listen, here's the best explanation I can come up with. Jesus had an identical twin. They were separated at birth. And then it just so happened, I'm not making this up, it just so happened that at the weekend of the Passion when Jesus was executed, his identical twin just showed up in Jerusalem. And he realized what was happening, and he saw an opportunity. He said, here I am, risen from the dead. And William Lane Craig had this response, is this what it's come to? If this is what we have to believe to deny the resurrection, we're in pretty good shape. No, friends, no explanation fits the evidence better than the explanation given by those previously gutless disciples. Remember them? Those same men whose knees were knocking behind locked doors, who were now putting their lives on the line for this testimony: he who is dead is alive. He is risen. I ask you, what would transform a group of shivering, shaken men who had scattered, who had abandoned Jesus, some of them even denied they even knew Jesus, hiding from the authorities, doors locked, lights out? What could have transformed them into vibrant witnesses for Jesus, standing in the face of the same men who crucified Jesus, being threatened with flogging for their testimony, and they say, flog if you must, but we cannot stop speaking that which we've seen or heard? What would cause Saul of Tarsus, a man so dedicated to his religion that he rounded up men and women to have them beaten and executed because they proclaimed the risen Christ? What would cause such a man to turn on a dime and take his place with those he persecuted on Christ's behalf, eventually giving his life for the very gospel he despised? What explains that? Only one answer will do, and it is the answer that Peter gave in Acts chapter 2, verse 32, this Jesus God raised up again, as we are witnesses. And if risen, then Jesus is the Son of God. Because as Paul says in Romans chapter 1, he was declared with power to be the Son of God by the resurrection. And if risen, then we have been forgiven, because he who was delivered over for our transgressions was raised for our justification. Romans 4:25. We know we've been forgiven because Jesus came out of the grave. And if risen, we now have no condemnation, because this same Jesus who rose from the dead now stands at the right hand of the Father and is constantly making intercession for you and I, and we need it. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. The second miracle then, the resurrection, becomes the hinge pin for everything that follows. Two miracles. The first miracle, a trade that ends the battle between us and God, bringing mercy and forgiveness, atonement. The second miracle, a defeat of death that secures eternity for those who trust in Christ.